Greetings, class. As you know, we all have to do a project on the most boring type of history in existence, Canadian history. I, of course, live in Barristan, where our 1 year, 5-month history is much more entertaining than that of Canada. But, of course, going to school in Canada means I must do Canadian history, which is completely and utterly boring except for this guy. I, of course, chose the most interesting aspect that is not Mr. Chrétien, the Canadian Pacific Railroad. I'll be covering it in 3 sections: before construction, construction, and impact. Construction began on February 16, 1881, but the real starting point of the CPR was 10 years before, when British Columbia joined the Dominion of Canada with the promise that they would be connected to the rest of the Dominion by a transcontinental railroad. In 1873, the contract for building the CPR was awarded to Sir Hugh Allan, a shipping magnate who was hoping to add a few railways to his empire. Unfortunately, this would not last, as it was uncovered that Macdonald and several other cabinet members were bribed by Allan to ensure that he got the contract. Macdonald resigned from Prime Minister on November 5, 1873. He was going to resign from his position as head of the Conservative Party of Canada, but was convinced otherwise by his fellow cabinet members. It seemed that the CPR was doomed, but then soon after, Macdonald's successor, Alexander Mackenzie, got into power, and economic depression occurred in the young country. The depression was caused by outside factors, but the people of Canada blamed Mackenzie anyway, and in 1878, Macdonald was once again elected as Canada's Prime Minister. Mackenzie had started construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, but in 1880, only 700 kilometers of track had been laid, 300 kilometers usable. Then in October of 1880, Macdonald awarded George Stephen, James J. Hill, Duncan McIntyre, Richard B. Angus, and John Stuart Kennedy $25 million and 25 million acres of land, an exemption from property tax for 20 years if they built the railway. They agreed. Canadian Pacific Railway was founded and incorporated, and construction began. A couple of routes were proposed for the CPR, such as a route through the fertile belt of Saskatchewan and through Yellowhead Pass, but a more southerly route was chosen that stayed relatively near to the American border and through Creaking Horse Pass. The route had its advantages, but the team of surveyors, which the government put too much reliance on, who surveyed the route, went when it was abnormally rainy, so the land was reported as fertile, but was actually as hot, semi-arid land where not much would grow. In 1882, the pace of construction was too slow for Macdonald, so he hired railway executive William Cornelius Van Horne. Van Horne claimed that he could build 800 kilometers of track in 1 year. And while floods delayed the start of the construction season that year, he still managed to construct 700 kilometers of main line and other secondary lines. And by 1883, the railway had reached the Rocky Mountains. In 1884, the CPR reached the hardest part of its journey, the Canadian Rockies. At this time, it is estimated that more than 9,000 Chinese workers were hired to construct the railway. They were paid 75 cents an hour, had to pay for their own equipment and food, and were almost always given the most dangerous jobs, such as blasting and bridge building. It was estimated that 1,500, 1/6 of the Chinese workforce, died during construction. Their families got no compensation and not even a notice of their death. On November 7, 1885, the last spike of the railway was driven in by Executive Donald Smith in Craigellachie, British Columbia. As you probably know, the CPR had a large impact on Canadian history. But you may not have known how large this impact was. The first and most major impact was the incorporation of BC into the Dominion of Canada. If Macdonald had not done this, it would have probably joined America, as America already had its transcontinental railway in the 1860s. If this had happened, then America may have thought that it was entitled to other parts of Western Canada and annex it as its own. This would starve Canada out of major gold rushes, a large agricultural sector, and the second largest supply of oil in the world, as well as a large economic boom. This economic boom is how the CPR ties into the Industrial Revolution. The CPR spread economic and industrial growth throughout the Dominion. So much, in fact, that from 1891 until World War I, Canada was the world's fastest growing economy, recovering quickly from that economic slump we discussed earlier. The CPR also helped bring inventions and practices that made that arid South Saskatchewan land that they surveyed farmable, and labor less intense throughout Western Canada. Because of this, Canada's agricultural sector boomed, and Canada was one of the world's largest exporters of wheat in World War II. Also, the world's eye turned to Canada when the last of America's Great Plains farmland was cultivated, bringing much investment and growth to the Canadian economy. The CPR had brought the Industrial Revolution to Canada, and so much so that Wilfrid Laurier claimed that the 20th century would be as prosperous as 19th century America.